On August 17, 1945, a small crowd gathered outside a modest house in Jakarta. There were no military parades, no foreign diplomats, and no powerful army standing behind the new nation. Sukarno stepped forward and read a short declaration. Beside him stood Mohammad Hatta. In only a few sentences, they announced that Indonesia was now an independent country. This moment became known as the Proclamation Kemerdekaan Indonesia, the Proclamation of Indonesian Independence. But declaring independence was the easy part. Keeping it would require 4 years of war, guerrilla resistance, political negotiation, and enormous sacrifice. The Netherlands refused to accept the loss of its former colony. Dutch forces returned, believing they could restore colonialism in Indonesia. The Indonesian people, however, had already decided that there would be no return to the past. This was the beginning of the Perjuangan Kemerdekaan Indonesia, the struggle for Indonesian independence. It was a conflict that would transform Southeast Asia and prove that an empire could occupy cities, arrest political leaders, and win major battles, yet still lose control of a nation. For centuries, the islands that would become Indonesia attracted foreign powers because of their valuable resources. Spices, coffee, sugar, rubber, oil, and other products made the region enormously profitable. The Dutch gradually established control over much of the archipelago and created a colony known as the Dutch East Indies. Dutch colonialism brought great wealth to the Netherlands, but life for many Indonesians was defined by exploitation, heavy taxation, forced labor, and political inequality. The colonial administration controlled the economy and restricted political power. Most Indonesians had little influence over the government of their own homeland. By the beginning of the 20th century, however, a new nationalist movement was emerging. Educated Indonesians began to imagine the islands not as separate kingdoms and ethnic regions, but as one nation. Organizations calling for political reform and national unity began to appear. Their goal gradually changed from limited reform to the complete end of colonialism. Among the most important nationalist leaders was Sukarno. He was a gifted speaker who believed that Indonesians could overcome their regional, religious, and ethnic differences by uniting against Dutch colonial rule. His speeches attracted large audiences and worried the colonial authorities. Sukarno was arrested, imprisoned, and exiled, but his influence continued to grow. Mohammad Hatta also became a leading figure in the independence movement. Where Sukarno inspired crowds with powerful speeches, Hatta was known for political organization, economic thinking, and diplomacy. Together, they would eventually become the first president and vice president of independent Indonesia. Before independence could be declared, however, another occupying power arrived. In 1942, during the Second World War, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch colonial army collapsed quickly. For many Indonesians, the defeat of the Netherlands was a historic shock. The Europeans, who had presented themselves as permanently powerful, had been defeated by an Asian military force in only a few months. Some Indonesians initially hoped that Japan would bring liberation. Japanese propaganda claimed that it was freeing Asia from Western colonialism. But the reality of the Japanese occupation of Indonesia was brutal. Food became scarce. Civilians suffered from violence and repression. Large numbers of Indonesians were forced to work on military projects under terrible conditions. These forced laborers were often called romusha. Many were sent far from their homes, and countless people died from hunger, disease, exhaustion, and abuse. The Japanese occupation did not end suffering. It replaced one form of foreign domination with another. Yet the occupation also created conditions that would later help the Indonesian independence movement. The Japanese used nationalist leaders to mobilize public support. They allowed Sukarno and Hatta to speak to the population, although their activities remained under Japanese control. The occupation authorities also trained Indonesian youth and created military organizations, including PIDA, the Defenders of the Homeland. For the first time, thousands of Indonesians received military training, learned how to use weapons, and gained experience in organization and command. Japan intended these forces to defend its empire. Instead, many of their members would later use their training against the returning Dutch. By August 1945, Japan was facing complete defeat. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were followed by the Japanese decision to surrender. Suddenly, Indonesia entered a dangerous political vacuum. The Japanese empire had collapsed, but Allied forces had not yet fully arrived. The Dutch were preparing to return, while Indonesian nationalists understood that they had only a brief opportunity to act. Young activists demanded an immediate declaration of independence. They feared that hesitation would allow foreign forces to restore colonial rule before the new republic could be established. Some of them pressured Sukarno and Hatta to make the declaration without waiting for Japanese approval. On August 17, 1945, Sukarno read the proclamation in Jakarta. The red and white Indonesian flag was raised. The words were simple, but their meaning was revolutionary. Indonesia declared itself independent. News of the proclamation spread through radio broadcasts, newspapers, handwritten messages, and word of mouth. Across Java, Sumatra, and other islands, Indonesians raised the national flag and began taking control of government offices. Local groups formed revolutionary committees. Young fighters seized weapons from Japanese soldiers. A new republic was being created, but it had almost no time to prepare for the war that was coming. The first foreign troops to arrive in large numbers were British and Indian forces serving under Allied command. Their official responsibilities included accepting the Japanese surrender, disarming Japanese troops, and rescuing Allied prisoners of war. But Dutch officials and soldiers returned with them. The Netherlands still considered Indonesia to be its colony. From the Dutch point of view, the Japanese occupation had only interrupted colonial rule. From the Indonesian point of view, colonialism had ended forever. These two positions could not be reconciled peacefully. Tensions quickly turned into violence. Indonesian fighters refused to surrender their weapons. Dutch authorities attempted to restore their administration. British troops found themselves caught between a returning colonial power and a revolutionary population determined to defend independence. The most famous early battle of the Indonesian National Revolution took place in Surabaya. Surabaya was one of the largest cities in Java and an important center of revolutionary activity. Indonesian fighters had taken control of weapons and military equipment left behind by the Japanese. The city was filled with armed youth groups, former military trainees, local militias, and ordinary civilians prepared to resist foreign occupation. In late October 1945, fighting broke out between Indonesian forces and British troops. During the confusion, British Brigadier A.W.S. Malaby was killed. The British command responded by issuing an ultimatum. Indonesian fighters were ordered to surrender their weapons. They refused. On November 10, 1945, British forces launched a major attack on Surabaya. They used tanks, artillery, aircraft, and naval firepower. The defenders had courage in large numbers, but they lacked heavy weapons, coordination, and military supplies. The battle became a brutal struggle through streets, neighborhoods, and buildings. Thousands were killed and many civilians fled the city. Eventually, British forces captured Surabaya. Militarily, it was a defeat for the Indonesian revolutionaries. Symbolically, however, it became one of their greatest victories. The resistance demonstrated that Indonesians were willing to pay an enormous price for independence. November 10th later became Heroes' Day in Indonesia. The Battle of Surabaya also revealed an important truth. The Dutch might be able to return with modern weapons, but restoring colonialism would not be a simple police operation. It would require a major war against a population that increasingly saw independence as irreversible. During 1946, the conflict continued while Indonesian and Dutch representatives attempted to negotiate. The Republic of Indonesia controlled much of Java and Sumatra, but the Dutch held important cities, ports, and other regions. Both sides understood that the outcome would be decided through a combination of military power and diplomacy. The Linggadjati Agreement was negotiated in 1946. Under the agreement, the Dutch recognized the Republic's authority over Java, Madura, and Sumatra. The plan called for the creation of a federal Indonesian state connected to the Netherlands through a political union. But both sides interpreted the agreement differently. Many Indonesians feared that the federal structure was a Dutch strategy to divide the country and preserve colonial influence. The Dutch, meanwhile, believed the Republic was refusing to cooperate. The agreement failed to create lasting peace. In July 1947, the Netherlands launched a major military offensive. The Dutch called it a police action. In reality, it was a large military campaign involving aircraft, armored vehicles, artillery, and thousands of soldiers. Dutch forces moved into economically important areas, targeting plantations, ports, oil facilities, and transportation routes. They achieved rapid territorial gains. The Indonesian military could not defeat the Dutch in conventional battles, but the Indonesian War of Independence did not end. Instead, Republican forces withdrew from exposed positions and expanded guerrilla warfare. Small units attacked patrols, damaged bridges, disrupted roads, and targeted supply lines. They avoided direct confrontation whenever Dutch forces possessed overwhelming firepower. The objective was not always to hold territory. It was to make occupation expensive, dangerous, and politically unsustainable. The first Dutch military offensive also attracted international attention. India, Australia, and other countries criticized the Netherlands. The United Nations became involved and called for a ceasefire. A new agreement, known as the Renville Agreement, was signed in January 1948. Once again, it failed to solve the central problem. The Dutch wanted to limit the Republic, while Indonesian leaders demanded genuine sovereignty and the complete end of colonialism. The Republic was also facing serious internal difficulties. Its economy was weak, its military forces were divided, political groups disagreed over how the revolution should continue. In 1948, a violent internal conflict erupted in Median involving communist forces and the Republican government. The government suppressed the uprising, but the crisis weakened the Republic at a dangerous moment. The Dutch believed the Indonesian leadership was vulnerable. In December 1948, they launched a second major offensive. Dutch paratroopers and ground forces attacked Yogyakarta, the capital of the Republic. Sukarno, Hatta, and other senior leaders were arrested. The Netherlands announced that the Republic of Indonesia had effectively ceased to exist. But the declaration was premature. Before their capture, Republican leaders had prepared for the continuation of government. An emergency administration was established in Sumatra. More importantly, the Indonesian army remained active. General Sudirman became one of the most important figures in this stage of the Indonesian War of Independence. Sudirman was seriously ill with tuberculosis. Despite his condition, he refused to surrender. He left Yogyakarta and traveled through rural areas, often being carried on a simple stretcher while directing guerrilla operations. His presence became a symbol of resistance. As long as the army continued fighting and the emergency government continued operating, the Republic was still alive. Indonesian guerrillas increased their attacks and demonstrated that Dutch forces could capture major cities but could not fully control the countryside. In March 1949, Indonesian forces launched a coordinated attack on Yogyakarta. They occupied parts of the city for several hours before withdrawing. The attack did not permanently recapture the capital. Its purpose was political as much as military. It showed Indonesians and the outside world that the Republican army had not been destroyed. International pressure on the Netherlands continued to grow. The United Nations demanded the release of Indonesian political leaders and the restoration of the Republican government. The United States also increased pressure on the Dutch. After the destruction of the Second World War, the Netherlands depended heavily on American economic assistance. Washington was increasingly unwilling to support a costly colonial war that could create instability and strengthen radical political movements in Asia. The Dutch government now faced an impossible situation. Its military had captured valuable territory and important cities, but the resistance continued. The war damaged the Netherlands' international reputation, and the economic cost kept rising. Most importantly, millions of Indonesians no longer accepted Dutch rule as legitimate. The conflict could continue, but a permanent colonial victory had become almost impossible. Negotiations resumed. Sukarno and Hatta were released, and the Republican government returned to Yogyakarta. Later in 1949, Dutch and Indonesian representatives met at the Round Table Conference in The Hague. After difficult negotiations, the Netherlands agreed to transfer sovereignty. On December 27, 1949, sovereignty was formally transferred to the United States of Indonesia, a federal state that included the Republic and several Dutch-created territories. The federal system did not last long. Many Indonesians believed it had been designed to divide the country. By 1950, most of the federal states had joined the Republic, creating a more unified Indonesian state. One major dispute remained unresolved. The Netherlands did not immediately transfer West New Guinea, later known as West Papua, to Indonesia. That conflict would continue for more than a decade, but for most of Indonesia, the colonial war had ended. The Perjuangan Kemerdekaan Indonesia lasted more than 4 years. It included the Proclamation of Independence, the Battle of Surabaya, Dutch military offensives, guerrilla warfare, political crises, diplomacy, and international intervention. The Indonesian fighters did not defeat the Dutch by destroying their army in one decisive battle. They succeeded by refusing to allow colonial rule to become permanent again. They kept the Republic alive when its capital was occupied. They continued fighting when their leaders were imprisoned. They transformed every Dutch military victory into a new political problem. The Indonesian National Revolution also became part of a much larger transformation. After the Second World War, colonial empires across Asia and Africa began to collapse. Nationalist movements demanded independence, while European powers struggled to maintain control over territories they had ruled for generations. Indonesia became one of the earliest and most important examples of this new age of decolonization. On August 17, 1945, Sukarno and Hatta declared that Indonesia was independent. But independence did not come from the declaration alone. It came from the people who carried messages between villages, protected Republican officials, fought in the streets, resisted in the mountains, negotiated in foreign capitals, and refused to accept the return of colonialism. The Netherlands had better weapons. It had trained soldiers, aircraft, tanks, and international experience. But Indonesia possessed something the Dutch could not easily defeat: a population that had already begun to think of itself as one nation. The proclamation took only a few minutes to read. Turning those words into reality took 4 years of sacrifice. That was the true meaning of the Perjuangan Kemerdekaan Indonesia. Indonesia did not simply receive its freedom. It declared its freedom, defended it, and forced the world to recognize it.